Hey everybody, today we're going to take a look at the WGP Sniper. Despite the name, using this marker does not make you a paintball sniper, it's just the name of the marker that was originally developed by WGP way back in the fairly early days of paintball. This is a stacked tube pump marker, so it works the same way as many other stacked tube markers, except that you have to pump it each time instead of having it automatically recock like an autococker or a spider. The valve is right here in the lower tube, and behind that you have the hammer and the main spring. When you cock the marker, this pin going through the bolt pin, catches the slot in the top of the hammer, sets the hammer where it catches the sear, and when you pull the trigger, the sear releases the hammer, the drive spring pushes the hammer into the valve stem, compresses the valve spring, opens the valve, the air can go up through the bolt and push the paintball out of the chamber. So this is a stacked tube marker, pump operated. This design was developed into the autococker, where the pump is actually replaced by the pneumatic. So when you pull the trigger, not only do you fire the marker, but you also actuate the pneumatics that automatically resets everything. The big draw for this type of marker is that there are a ton of options. There is an almost limitless combination of parts you can use to construct one of these paintball markers. Arguably the most important part of a marker like this is the pump kit itself, and there are tons of options for the pump kits. This is a CCM Deluxe pump kit. WGP makes their own kits. CCM also makes a lightweight kit. White Wolf Airsmithing has a couple of kits. Vendetta, there are tons of different companies that make pump kits for snipers. Another option you have when it comes to the pump is a Hitman mod, and this is simply a vertical piece right here. It's a little vertical handle that hangs down from the pump. So instead of holding the pump like this, you can actually have your hand on the vertical regulator and pump it with your fingers. Now that does come with a downside that you have to pay attention to, because if you're not holding the pump when you pull the trigger, you'll get blowback, and the bolt will withdraw just a little bit each time when you fire. So you'll pull the trigger, and instead of it being nice and solid, you'll pull the trigger and it'll go. So when that happens, you're losing a little bit of air out the back and up the feed neck, so you're going to lose velocity. A lot of people, when they use a Hitman modded kit, don't hold the pump handle forward, so they lose a little bit of velocity because of that blowback, and that's just something to pay attention to. You also have tons of options for barrels, because these markers are almost universally autococker threaded, which is probably the most common type of barrel threading. You can get virtually any barrel on the market in cocker threads, so you have limitless options when it comes to the barrel. There are also a number of different frames on the market, but there are really two characteristics that you have to pay attention to. Do you want a swing frame or a hinge frame versus a slide frame? This is a slide frame because you see the trigger just slides back instead of swinging on a hinge. And do you want a single trigger versus a double trigger frame? Within those options, there are tons and tons of frame manufacturers. WGP, Benchmark, A&S, CCM, there are a lot of different frames you can get for these markers. And then there are the feed necks. These are actually threaded, which is great, so there are a lot of options for feed necks. This is a very basic Trinity clamping feed neck, but you get CCM and tons of other companies make feed necks for these bodies. And of course there are the bodies, which are also extremely highly variable. This is just a very basic WGP body from 2000, I believe, but there are the somewhat more ornate bodies going forward. Starting in the 03 bodies kind of got a little more milling from WGP, and then once you get like into the Nightcast and the Outcast bodies, the Black Magic bodies have some cool milling. But then there are tons of other companies that make their own bodies as well. You've got AIM, Free Flow, A&S. There are tons of other bodies out there that have been customized over the years that are floating around that you can use. And then of course there are the internals. You can have the standard WGP internals, no problem, those work great. Or you can get CCM internals, A&S internals. Lots of different companies have made internals for these markers over the years, so you can really set it up how you want. Heavier springs, lighter springs, high pressure, low pressure. It's up to you, and you have the options out there. And then finally, of course, you have the overall body configuration. How do you want this marker to look? You have three primary options there. It can be a full block, which is where the top tube is the same length as the bottom tube, and you have a back block, right? So you have the pump arm attached to the back block, and then you have a bolt pin that connects the bolt to the back block, and a cocking rod that goes through the back block into the hammer, and every time you pump it, you draw the back block backwards. That sets both the bolt and the hammer. You can also have a mid-block body. That's a full-size body. Usually there's a bit of material removed from the top tube, but I should say it's a full-length body. But there's no back block. Instead, the cocking rod connects to a little sled that runs in between the top and bottom tubes. And then there's a pin like this bolt pin that goes through the bolt and connects it to the hammer. So when you pump, you're actually moving that pin, and that's connected to both pieces that have to be withdrawn. And then finally, you have an option like this. This is a half block where most of the material at the back, or in this case, all of the material on the back part of the upper tube has been removed, and the bolt and sled are just kind of riding out there and they are exposed. Each of these configurations has its pros and cons. A full block body is going to be a bit heavier, and the velocity adjustment is a bit of a pain because in most cases you have to remove the cocking rod to be able to get a hex wrench in there. The rod will go through that hole. But there are a few exceptions to that rule. However, with a full block body, you're not going to get dirt and grime in there. It's a much more sealed system. A half block body is a nice compromise between the two because you lose the back block and usually some of the material on the upper tube, and it is a much lighter package than a full body with a back block. It's also much better sealed than a half block. A half block's at the other end of the spectrum, where sure, it's much lighter and velocity adjustment is much easier, but you have this slot right here where dirt and grime and sand and whatever can get in there and mess with the workings of the marker because it's exposed. For some half-block markers, like the CCM T2, people have actually made slot blockers. It's a little piece of metal that attaches to the sled, that's this piece right here, and extends to cover that slot so that it's never really open. But the point of all of that was basically just to say that you can set this up however you want. Bodies, barrels, pump kits, feed necks, overall configurations, frames. You can have these markers set up however you want. That's the real strength of the Sniper platform. Within all of those options, on a fairly strict budget, you can make a really high-performing marker. It doesn't take much to throw a pump kit on a WGP body, get a decent regulator and a nice barrel kit, and you're set for maybe a couple $100. You have a really nice high-performing pump marker. However, if you really want to go crazy, you could get a super high-end, CCM T2, or build your own that uses CCM parts and has all different internals and regulator, an AKA regulator or something, whatever, and make for $400, $500, $600 a really, the Bentley of pump paintball markers. This platform gives you those options to go a more budget route or to go a super high-end route. And you're going to get decent performance no matter which way you go. If you go the super high-end route, of course you're going to get better performance than if you build kind of a budget one for $125. But at the end of the day, the differences are going to be smaller than you might expect. For those reasons, this is probably the single most popular type of pump marker out there. You see tons and tons of people using these. They're especially preferred in open class games because you can set these up for an auto trigger. You need to have a little actuating rod connected from the pump arm down to a piece that replaces the safety, and then you can just hold the trigger and pump. These markers are not set up like that by default, unlike a Nelson-based marker like a Phantom, where from the factory they have auto triggers. These do not. You need to get a separate kit for the auto trigger. There are relatively few of those available. CCM might be the only one. But other than that, this marker really comes jam-packed with options and is a great performer. That's my take on the WGP Sniper platform. Thanks for watching. See you next time.